Walter Mondale had a way of saying this in the Carter administration. He says, we talked about the short-term pain and the long-term gain, and boy did we emphasize the short-term pain. And any change to the better usually has transactions costs that in the short term make things worse for a little while until the economy has time to adjust to the new ground rules. And I think we're facing a lot of that in the future. So that's why I thought it was a good question. And my argument is if you say we can become energy independent by 2000, well, they were saying last night in 8 to 10 years, so say 8 would be 2016, then give me the milestones along the way so that it isn't all done the last year, you know, because that's the only way we're going to get results. So I think there's a challenge for the politicians. I think there's a challenge for those of us who evaluate politicians and this is a fairly young audience, so I would say it should be easy for you to take the long-term view. We really need to be thinking both on setting short-term objectives, but for the purpose of creating a better country in the year 2020, the year 2030, the year 2040. If we think in those terms, then I think it'll be clear where we need to go in energy. I would suspect that this crowd has a lot of questions. It looks like a very bright, well-read crowd. So I'm going to stop at this point, and you can throw up just about any question you want, and I can always be a presidential candidate and duck it if I think it's too tough. So I guess people are going to line up over here, and I'm ready to go.
Thank you.
Had lots of questions at the Rotary Club today, so don't be bashful.
Got one over here.
Okay. Can you come up to the mic?
How commercially viable is this algae-based development of fuels?
That's a good question. I am generally a technology skeptic, and so I don't go out on a limb recommending new technologies or sort of suggesting that there'll be a major solution. But I've made an exception with algae because I've looked at it from every angle, and I've been trying to find the weak spot of it. And it may turn out that there is a weak spot because until something's in commercial production, you don't really know. The closest thing to commercial production that I'm aware of is up at MIT. They actually have a demonstration plant up there. And I didn't mention that algae actually collects, you have to use carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, to grow it. So it has that additional benefit. So I haven't read a recent report on the MIT project, but I think it's going well. Chevron, Shell, and I think BP are the 3 oil companies that are devoting a lot of resources to it. And I've noticed that quite a few universities now are moving into it. I was speaking at Arizona State a couple weeks ago, and they have an algae fuels program there. I read in the paper today that I think maybe Michigan State was looking at one for this state. So it's sort of out there, and I don't want to suggest that I can promise at this point that it's a solution. But if I was going to put government resource dollars behind something, I would put it behind algae fuels. Now the irony is, in 1998, our federal government, in its wisdom, terminated the federal algae fuels program. And the reason was that they didn't have lobbyists. There was no one that had an economic stake in it, so there were no lobbyists. It was, however, the most strategically important program in my estimation. So that's going to come back at the federal level. I think people are more aware now. But that's a good question. We shouldn't put all of our eggs in that basket till we're absolutely sure it can be commercially viable. But to give you an example, right now for diesel fuel, if we can use waste oils from restaurants and produce a certain amount of biodiesel that way. But the main feedstock right now is soybeans, and that's a very expensive food crop. Algae, in just one layer of an algae pond, you can grow 15 times as much oil per acre as you can from algae. But they don't have to use just one layer. They have these pipes that go up, and you can get like 15 layers. And so the economies in use of land are tremendous. And it may, there are no silver bullets out there. There's a lot of silver buckshot, but this is the closest thing to a silver bullet that I see out there. Yes.
Hey, Jay, while we're waiting, would you like some?
Yeah.
I just have a question about environmentally friendly cars, and I can't remember where I was reading it at, but someone had proposed a theory that buying a newer used car, one that's already been built that gets like 25, 35 miles to the gallon, is actually more environmentally friendly than buying a brand new car brand new hybrid car rather, and I was wondering if you could comment on that, what your opinion is, or if you've heard the same theory.
Yeah, I think that that checks out pretty much. It takes a lot of energy to build a car. So what I say in the book is, if you have a car that gets fairly good mileage, and it's still got a lot of life in it, I would probably continue to drive that car rather than trade it in right away to get the most fuel efficient model. The key is that whenever you trade cars, really pay a lot of attention to the mileage rating on the sticker, because that's the point at which it makes a difference. But there's a friend of mine named Eric Roston who wrote a book called The Age of Carbon, and if you're interested in sort of the theory of carbon and the bigger context for global climate change, it's a great book. He's a former writer for Time, and we were on a panel together, and he said, you know, I have the most efficient transportation in the system. It's some mammoth Buick that's like 20 years old, but he lives in New York and he drives it at most once a week, and it's an old car that he keeps going. So I think that's a valid point. But the point that's, I think, most important is that when you buy a new air conditioner, or you buy a new refrigerator, or a new car that may last for 5, 10, or more years, pay a lot of attention to the mileage efficiency standard at that point. That's the most economic way to deal with this problem. Thanks.
Jay, we hear a whole lot in Michigan about Detroit converting over to hydrogen fuel cells and that kind of thing. What's the realistic appraisal you would give of that, and what percentage of the solution that would be, and that sort of thing?
Okay, that's a good question. You know, when I started doing my research, I said there's almost nothing new in energy policy, and virtually everything that we talk about today were being discussed in the 1970s. And then I found in the Nixon files during his first term, he was invited to a demonstration of hydrogen fuel cells in Connecticut. And President Ford's staff was talking about hydrogen fuel cells, and then it became the lead item for President Bush's first term energy policy. The way to look at this is that hydrogen does not exist in nature, and it is not a source of energy. So you can store energy in several ways. If you're creating energy through nuclear power or combustion of coal, natural gas, oil, you could pump it up, water up high, and then that's stored energy that can come down at some point. You can compress air, which would then be a stored energy source, or you can create hydrogen, which would be a stored energy source. And some of the hydrogen advocates have argued that it's pollution-free. Well, it's pollution-free in the automobile, but somewhere there's an electric plant or somewhere something that's producing the hydrogen, and at that point it's polluting. So hydrogen has a lot of nice properties to it, but I think that Detroit is making the decision, which I would agree with, that the plug-in electric vehicle is a much more viable option. And the reason for that is we have an electric grid that's already out there, and we do not have a pipeline system to deliver hydrogen around the country, and it would be extremely expensive to build. Hydrogen is not a very dense fuel, so you would not get much range from a hydrogen fuel car. And with electric cars, they can be recharged at night. It takes several hours to recharge an electric car, but if you have the right kind of plug in your garage, you can do it at a time when the electric system is not in great use, and therefore we wouldn't even have to build any new electric plants to handle a lot of these new cars.